I've never really seen a midterm election like this. You have a substantial percentage of the country disapproving of a Democratic president, thinking the country's on the wrong track, and yet so many people in battleground states rejected Republicans. Democrats are going to hold the Senate, if not pick up a seat. If Kevin McCarthy becomes Speaker, and that's an if, he'll have the slimmest of majorities. What went wrong for the Republican Party?
Well, I think the biggest issue that played out in the midterms is something that I've talked about a lot over the course of the past 8 years, which is voters, generally speaking, especially in battleground states, aren't interested in extremism. They just aren't. They want people who they believe are going to be reasonable, who are going to be collaborative, and who represent sort of the fundamental tenet of democracy, that it's supposed to be a distributed decision-making model, and you're supposed to be okay with that. And I think in the midterms, one of the big lessons that the Republican Party nationally needs to take away from it is voters want collaborative elected officials. They don't want extremes.
You are going to be succeeded by a Democrat. Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, he's also going to be succeeded by a Democrat. Both of you popular two-term Republican governors in Democratic states, and yet the Republican voters picked MAGA extremist candidates that had no chance of winning a general election. I don't understand what's going on with your party. Is it the influence of Donald Trump? Is it the influence of a movement that doesn't care about winning general elections?
Well, I certainly think there's significant influence from the former president, and I think that influence probably hurt the party and hurt the party's chances on election day, not just here in Massachusetts and Maryland, but in many of those other battleground states. What voters want are candidates who are going to, and elected officials who are going to reach out, who are going to engage with the so-called other side, and who are going to take seriously this idea that you are supposed to try to represent and hear the voices of all of the people that you serve.
When you talk about the Republican Party needing to heed these lessons, I'm wondering if one of the things you're thinking of is we saw some Republican leaders who are not election liars, at least not explicitly so. Governor Youngkin of Virginia, Governor DeSantis of Florida, going and endorsing extremists. Kari Lake in Arizona, Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. I'm from Pennsylvania. I've never seen a candidate statewide like that. Do you think that the DeSantises and Youngkins of the world are the kinds of people that need to be thinking about, look, I can't be throwing away my credibility on these extremists?
The big message coming out of Tuesday, and I would argue the big message voters are going to send going forward, is you need to demonstrate in word and deed that you believe this is more, but this is always going to be about more than just your party and your partisans. That was the whole point of the lecture I gave at the Kennedy School a couple of weeks ago, where my whole message was that the parties are losing millions of voters every year who are giving up on them and becoming independents. Massachusetts, 60% of the electorate at this point are registered independents or unenrolled voters, depending upon what term you like. But that's a big statement that people are making about what they think about the narrowness of the vision and the attitude of the parties.
So let's talk about your speech at Harvard, because in addition to faulting extremism, you talked about social media having what you called a, quote, profoundly negative consequences for nations and for our nation and for our politics. You said, quote, finding people who share your love of gardening is just as easy as finding people who share your love of hate speech. So what can be done?
So that was part of the reason I talked about that was I was so amazed by what David Bowie said in 1999. For those of your viewers who are not old enough to remember, they should just Google Ziggy Stardust. But David Bowie was a very well-known musical artist and artist generally in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And he gave an interview at the end of the 90s where he said that what the internet was going to be was unimaginable, and that it would be exhilarating and terrifying, and that it would completely change everything about the relationship between the content producer and the content user and receiver. And he was right. And he said because of this, there will be a duality here. There will be certain things the internet that will do that will be wonderful and amazing, and that's absolutely the case. But he also said it would create tremendous disruption and this capacity for for a very dark side to find itself and to leverage it and to make it something where truth would be defined by the users and the producers. And I think in some ways he was right, you know, and he was the only one who was talking about this back then. I give him huge credit. And I think the challenge for all of us is to accept and recognize that the internet is there, social media is there, but what does it really stand for and represent? And I've said for a long time that I do not believe the vast majority of the people who get up and go to work every day, get up and go to school every day, worry about their families and their communities and their kids and their neighbors, spend anywhere near as much time on social media caring about politics as people in politics and people in media think they do. And I view it as a universe. It's a big one. It's loud. It's organized. It's influential. It's noisy. But it's not where most people live. And I think at some point, we as a society need to accept and understand that those folks are going to work really hard to drag as many voices and as many eyeballs onto their platforms as they possibly can. But they aren't where big chunks of the world lives.
I think about social media, and I think that we've seen two effects of it in recent years. One, January 6th. That is a president putting out lies on social media, people responding on social media, Twitter, Facebook, all sorts of other
Finding
ones.
each other, too. I mean,
Finding each other,
You can't
yeah.
underestimate the power of
Exactly.
being able to find each other and create, you know, isolated little groups of people who are bent a certain way with respect to how they think about society and rules and mores and all the rest. As isolated individuals out there, that's one thing, but when they all find each other, that's different.
You have always credited your attitude towards politics, towards how you were raised by a liberal Democrat mom and a conservative Republican dad. And I'm wondering what lessons specifically you learned from that made you the politician you are in terms of the positions you take, but also you haven't been an outspoken critic of Donald Trump. You've been critical of him when asked, but you haven't been out there criticizing him. And you are the most popular governor in the country in a Democratic Commonwealth.
So my mom and dad were happily married for 60 years before my mom passed away, and they never voted for the same person. And our dinner table was hilarious. And a lot of my friends would come to watch. But if they got called on, some of them didn't come back for a second time. But the point here was it wasn't a fight, it wasn't a contest, it wasn't even really a debate, it was a discussion and an inquiry. And one of the things that was true from the beginning was if my parents really thought you weren't listening to what somebody else was saying and you were just trying to jam home your own point, you would get penalized and told, you know, you got to either answer their question or, you know, we're going to skip you for the next few rounds here. And the biggest message I took from it was you learn a lot from listening to people you don't always agree with. And that's certainly been true for me in public life. I am so much better as a person and as an elected official because of the conversations I've had with people whose life experiences and whose points of view are different than mine than I ever would have been if I just talked to people I agreed with. And
can you give me an example of that? Because, I mean, you come from a very elite background. Your father worked for the Secretary of Transportation during the Nixon years. You went to Harvard Graduate School, and you also went to Kellogg at Northwestern. So you come to this job with a set of priors, as we all do for everything we do. Who opened your mind?
So after I ran 3 times for governor. I lost the first time in 2010 to former Governor Deval Patrick. And I went and talked to the media, people who covered the race. I talked to a lot of the chattering class. I talked to a whole bunch of people. I went and talked to my friends. And it was really humiliating. Everybody told me what I did wrong and what a horrible candidate it was. But one guy in particular said to me, you spent way too much time with your customers and not enough time with your prospects. And so when Lauren, my wife, and I decided to run in 2014, I spent a lot of time campaigning in places where there weren't any Republicans, a lot of cases where there weren't really even any white people. And a lot of those folks were surprised to see me. They'd never seen anybody running for office before at the state level who was a Republican. And I just listened. I asked them questions. I didn't really talk very much. And I learned a lot, and a lot of what I learned from those conversations factored into the way we appointed people, to the way we organized a lot of our programming, to where we focused, especially during the pandemic, on communities that I knew were going to be in more trouble than others if we didn't step up and help them. And it changed the way I thought about a lot of things, and in a good way, and made me, as I said, I think a much better public official than I would have been otherwise. A lot of those conversations were really uncomfortable, okay? But the biggest thing I took from it is that learning, especially learning things that you maybe not want to hear.
Like what?
That's a painful process.
Like what?
That this country for a very long time made it really hard through zoning and public housing and mortgage finance policy for black people or Hispanic people to own a home. And that is, in fact, the #1 way people in America have built wealth for decades.
That's fascinating, and that's just something you learned by going there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure you'd read about it before, but actually seeing it.
There's nothing quite like talking to people who bring a real-world, real-life experience to a conversation. Now, when people yell at each other, right, they're just yelling past each other. Nobody's hearing anything either side is saying, all right? You got to be willing to go listen and stop walking in there with a point of view or an attitude that you already know the answer to the questions.
It seems like so much of how politicians address these issues is about demonizing the other side on critical race theory, on trans students. I see a lot of people in the Republican Party doing that, and there's probably a very nuanced view that a lot of people in the center have about a lot of these issues.
Totally agree with that. I think the whole question about racism generally, I happen to think there's a nuanced conversation to be had on that too. But if you were to ask me if the Democrats and Republicans are having a nuanced conversation on that, my answer would be no.